Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. And there is so much to understand about it. We are confronted on a daily basis with a torrent of information and knowledge, and we're trying to sift our way through all that data. Let's go to Mick Ryan, who is a retired Australian general, to give us some opinions of his own concerning what might take place in the wake of the Wagner mutiny. He says the ripples from the Wagner mutiny in Russia over the weekend continue to propagate across the Russian systems. A quick assessment of the impact of Russia's fighting power. So we're going to go through a nice chunky thread of his. Just before we do so, it's worth remembering that Surovikin, the butcher of Syria, was last seen giving a message to Prigozhin when Prigozhin was doing his mutiny. And interestingly, someone pointed out today that actually that video where he's giving an appeal to Prigozhin, he's not got any of his military paraphernalia on him. He's got a very plain uniform, but with none of the stars and medals or any of that stuff. Just completely plain and like he's never seen before like that. So I was wondering whether already he was in custody at that point. His number two, I think, has also been detained. So, there are those ripples that are certainly taking place. So, the leader of the mutiny, Prigozhin, says Ryan, has been transported into exile in Belarus, reportedly staying in the only hotel in the capital of Belarus without opening windows. It is unlikely he will remain quiet or inactive for long. In Moscow, Putin has made several television appearances, has denounced those who participated in the mutiny as traitors, and has heralded to courageous Russian soldiers and airmen who resisted the mutiny as it crept north towards the Russian capital. The mutiny has highlighted the brittleness of the Russian institutions of state. Putin will remain as president of Russia, but for how long is anyone's guess. Peter Tetch's excellent article on this is worth reading, and he links that. But he continues, while it remains too early to make a full assessment of how the Wagner mutiny will impact on battlefield operations in Ukraine, there is a potential for three key repercussions on Russian military fighting power. Fighting power generally encompasses the intellectual, physical, and moral aspects of military organizations. It is a framework I've used in other assessments. The physical aspects of war, the material, the fighting forces, provide the mass of people and equipment employed in conflicts. In the physical dimension, the Wagner mutiny will henceforth deny the Russian army some of its best shock troops in the eastern part of Ukraine. Right. Just to add to this, news just out, and I have this lined up for tomorrow's news piece already, is that it appears that Wagner will not be taking part in the war anymore. Now, I don't know whether that's going to be an official line that there will be convenient loopholes to, and you actually see Wagner being used if they can be recruited. I guess this is a case of also cutting your losses. The tensions between the Wagner PMC and the Russian conventional military forces, they are significant, and that it would cause maybe too much acrimony for Wagner to be incorporated into the Russian armed forces. Too much of a risk, too many tensions, as I say. But yeah, I mean that is huge. You've got 25,000 troops apparently, possibly 5,000 of them elite and well trained. Suddenly, who were on the front line, who were fighting. So you've already got an armed force that is struggling for numbers. There have been these calls for or exasperation over the fact that there hasn't been a mass mobilization. So Putin has not gone for a mobilization. He's got a large front line in Ukraine that is thinly populated with Russian defenses. The reserves have already been called up, it appears. Wagner, 25,000 then, have been taken away from that defensive force and are unable to be used apparently going forward. You might, there's talk of 1 to 2% of them already being pushed into the or choosing to go into the armed forces, but in general, you are taking that capacity of troops and removing them from the front line. This makes the Russians' ability to defend much, much harder, much more difficult. or more challenging. They they are really up against it now. I mean, they were up against it before, but going forward, this will affect the physical aspect of war. Sorry, as Mick Ryan is discussing here. In the 2023 Russian offensive in eastern Ukraine, overseen by General Gerasimov, squandered lives and material with little gain. The only bright spot from a Russian perspective was the capture of Bakhmut, or the 98% capture of Bakhmut. While this was not entirely a Wagner operation, it is hard to see how the Russians would have captured the city without the Wagner group's cunning use of human waves and elite ground forces. Well, there's a couple of things to say about that. He's right. Okay, it was Wagner, but it wasn't just Wagner. And actually, I would argue if the VDV and other conventional forces, DPR and whatnot, hadn't come in to support Wagner so that Wagner could intensify their own forces in the Bakhmut city area, I don't think Wagner would have prevailed. They had culminated. The ISW were talking about how they were culminating, and that went on for about a month. So your Russian shills are saying, "Oh, they see that ISW don't know what they're talking about. They hadn't culminated." No, they hadn't culminated because the Russian MOD had realised they were going to culminate, and so piled in a load of their conventional forces to support them, who then took over the flanks in the north and the south. That then allowed Wagner to continue a more intensive fight in the city centre. They pretty much took the city centre, and then the Russian conventional forces weren't in a decent position to hold the flanks, and it's simple counterattacks have left us where we are now. Wagner have pulled out. It's all going to go south. But I think it was a combination of, yes, Wagner did all the heavy lifting up to that point for sure. But I think that they had culminated, and if it wasn't for those conventional forces, Bakhmut wouldn't have been even remotely in the hands of the Russians as it at one point was. Um, Mick Ryan goes on to say, but Wagner was just one of many private military companies operating under the Russian military in Ukraine. A key benefit of these organizations, at least for Putin, is that their casualties are not recorded as official casualties in the war. However, with the recent directive from Defense Minister Shoigu that all private military companies must sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense, private military companies are in essence being absorbed into the Russian military. Intellectual element. So that's your physical element and the physical ramifications of the mutiny. So intellectual element. Beyond these physical impacts, there will also be implications for the intellectual dimension of Russian fighting power. Despite Prigozhin's demands, it is unlikely that Putin will remove Defense Minister Shoigu or General Gerasimov. They have overseen adaptation to Russian forces during the war, but generally it has been less imaginative and slower to adapt than the Ukrainians. Perversely, Prigozhin's mutiny may have solidified the positions of these two senior Russian leaders. Yeah, there is this law of unintended consequences there, where he tried to capture those two leaders, tried to hold them hostage, I guess, and in doing so, failed to do that, and in doing so, solidified their hold on those positions. Yeah, interesting. In war, the rationale for the war was fatally undermined by Prigozhin as well. Prigozhin's crossed the Rubicon in his mutiny when he issued a video last week which challenged the purpose of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. In war, purpose matters. It provides the inspiration that soldiers risk their lives for. Openly undermining the strategic rationale for the war will be a form of intellectual corrosion of Russian fighting power. I agree with that. Igor Girkin's talked a number of times about how the Russians, and he went to the front line and he fought on the front line for a short while and spoke to a lot of people on the front line and continues to speak to a lot of people on the front line. And he has long said that they don't know what they're fighting for. The Russians there just don't know what they're doing, partly because their commanders don't really know what they're doing, and the hierarchical kind of structure within the Russian armed forces. But it's just a case of following orders. But actually, there's no kind of sense of purpose for the Russian forces in the same way that the Ukrainians clearly have a sense of purpose in fighting for their family, friends, loved ones, homeland, culture, history, etc., etc. The Russians, none of that. Is very much a negative thing rather than a positive thing. It's kind of like we want to eradicate Nazis. Yeah, but half of us are Nazis. Yeah. But uh, don't confuse me. I mean, that's what we're doing, right? We're denazifying. Yeah, but are we really? Uh, okay, and the purpose is like at best muddled, at worst completely non-existent. Okay, so this leads to a final part of Russia's fighting power that has been impacted by the events of last weekend, the moral elements. The moral aspects of fighting power include things like esprit de corps, the values and ethical stance of military organizations, how the various levels of an institution interact and trust each other, and their general morale. Within the Russian military, there will be deep discomfort among many leaders in Ukraine and beyond about the loyalty of different units. There will be a continuing unease among senior leaders about who they can trust in their chain of command above and below them. There are already reports that the former overall commander of Russian forces in Ukraine, General Surovikin, knew of Prigozhin's plans in advance. This will prove corrosive in the Russian systems, and the lack of trust will pervade all the way to the office of the president. This deficit in trust by members of the military and security forces, as well as by the general public looking at these organizations, will also degrade the morale of leaders and soldiers in the field. And while this is yet to manifest in battlefield outcomes, it will increase the pressure that Russian forces are exposed to under the current Ukrainian onslaught. There remains much that is to be revealed about the Prigozhin mutiny, and there are certain to be elements that may never be revealed to the public. It will irrevocably change the status of private military companies in Russia, and the mutiny will slowly, over time, corrode the fighting power of the Russian military. The Ukrainians, who know the Russian military better than anyone on this planet, will be sure to exploit this. And this also goes back when you're talking about military fighting power, just goes back to something I've talked about so often, which is Russia just can't win a war. But looking at it at the moment, I mean, Putin can't win a war because actually, what are the objectives for a start? Is it the maximalist objective of taking over Ukraine? Well, you just can't do that. You're not in a position to be able to do that. It is physically impossible. It is kind of like mentally impossible, as in you've got 40 odd million Ukrainians who don't want you there. You can't occupy them. You just don't have the ability to do that. So you can't win this thing. You can maybe hold on to Crimea tops, if the wind's in your going in the right direction and there's some pixie dust thrown into the mix. You can maybe come out with the 2014 annexed nations, but I doubt it. And why I doubt it is that you are not mobilizing, you're losing 25,000. You are doing a kind of crypto mobilization where you're doing a kind of underhand, secretly kind of mobilizing, stretching out the legislation to incorporate, a wider range of people that you can mobilize and so on and so forth. And people are, getting sent to the front line, but not in a sense of a mass mobilization that will be political suicide. But as a result of that, the Russians do not have the ability to defend what they have now effectively. So they are relying entirely on minefields. Really, I would go as far as to say. So if you suddenly eradicated minefields right up and down the country, you would have seen. I'm pretty sure even including keeping trenches there. I'm pretty sure you would have seen the major part of an offensive take place in several areas already. I'm fairly sure that's how important minefields are, and that is what is holding the Ukrainians back. Not the forces, not the force quantity, or the force certainly the force quality. None of that's holding the Ukrainians back. It is minefields. I don't know. Let me know what you think. Well, I've been threatening to talk about Hungary. I had a section on, or sort of mentioned Orban and Hungary, and Orban saying some pretty egregious things the other day. And my views on Orban are pretty obvious. My views on Hungary's political situation, predicament, are pretty obvious as well. There's been democratic backsliding there as Orban has embraced authoritarianism in the vein of Putin. It seems to me that Putin and the Russian political system is something, or are some things that Orban wants to emulate. And he's trying very hard to do that with changes to the judiciary in line with a kind of autocratic posturing. We've got clampdown on free media, etc., etc. So, Hungary is a bit of a difficult place, I would say, at the moment. And but I wanted some Hungarian opinions on that, and I luckily, I have a fairly varied, geographically speaking, viewership, and some people answered. So let's get what will undoubtedly be a varied opinion of the situation in Hungary. So we'll start with, I'm a Hungarian living in the UK. When I travel to Hungary, I'm always shocked about media, news, and people. No freedom of press. The public view is skewed, says Franks here, or Frank S. Putin, Erdogan, etc., largely supported by the state media. Any anti-Orban Putin opinion gets hammered in state media or by internet trolls. That is, where it's at there. Someone did call me out. Obviously, a pro-Hungarian or pro-Russian voice here. The speaker oddly forgot, which is me, to mention that 1.5 million Ukrainians that the problematic political entity of Hungary is sheltering. So I called Hungary the problematic political entity. But the reality is, that is something that needs to be taken into account. There are a lot of refugees, Ukrainian refugees in Hungary, or there have been. There was also no mention of the fuel Hungary is sending to keep Ukrainian tanks in motion. He also forgot to mention that during this time, the country is in the process of outlawing education of all minorities in their own language, including that of Hungarians. 30% of the weapons sent to Ukraine are now available on black markets in Europe and Africa, as their patriotic leadership is busy getting rich on the war. These are only a fraction of the issues around Ukraine. Now, this is basically nonsense. So this tells me this person is either just, a Putin shill, or is actually Russian. There is absolutely no evidence of black market use of the weapons. The US has looked into this. Yeah, it's just not true. And 30% of the weapons, so like all those millions of rounds, there are literally millions of rounds, millions of guns. I don't know, 30% of tanks, is that? Like, there are literally hundreds of tanks just floating around on the black market now. It's just, complete nonsense. But there are things that Hungary will be doing as well. But the question is, are they doing enough? What is their posturing for the Ukraine war? There are some more. I mean, again, see, I wonder whether there is a sense that Russian trolls are spouting some of the kind of pro-Hungary talking points that show that they are doing things. So Hungary is offering temporary protection to Ukrainian refugees. They get financial assistance as well as access to health services and schools for children. However, Hungary is mostly a country of transit for refugees coming directly from Ukraine or through Romania and going west in search of greener pastures. Romania apparently not being to their taste. The speaker attacking Hungary looks rather ungrateful and entitled, ticks all the boxes of what the French call langue de bois, using all the buzzwords, in my humble opinion. Thank you for your humble opinion. So I just want to make sure I get some actual Hungarian positions here. Right, here we have one that's worth sharing. So first and foremost, so thank you, Nico C. Dandelion. I despise Putin's Russia and hope and pray that Ukraine takes back all its territory. I'm second generationally removed from Hungary. My mum emigrated in 1951. I've been back several times and speak passable Hungarian. All my life, I've heard stories about how Hungary was broken into pieces as a result of its subservient relationship to Austria prior to the First World War. And that as part of war reparations for a war, it basically started Austria through Hungary under the bus. Hungary lost 66% of its territory and its people to pay for Austria's sins. My grandmother's family was taken from the towns they had established and had to emigrate to what was left of Hungary. Hungarian language was outlawed in the annexed regions. Romania bulldozed whole Hungarian towns, and those who stayed in their ancestral towns were often forced to change their last name, refrain from certain cultural practices, and Hungarian was no longer taught in the schools. This is a trauma that has haunted Hungarians for hundreds of years, and keeps them from making the same mistakes, always backing the wrong horse. Hungary, under grudging Nazi rule, gained back part of Czechoslovakia, and later that chunk, Transcarpathia, was taken by the Soviets into Ukraine. As Ukraine struggles to throw off its cultural yoke of Russia, instituting reforms that officialize Ukrainian language, the tiny Hungarian minority might have lost the legal right to learn Hungarian in school in that attempt to unify Ukraine. Even an innocent turn in this linguistic direction that would change the status of the small Hungarian minority rubs salt in a very old and very ingrained Hungarian wound. The recognition of Orban of this wound in his wearing of a scarf with the old Hungarian borders, and I don't even remember I showed you that he was wearing a scarf that had the old borders of Hungary, which is highly controversial. Like really showing that actually he wants those you know geographical areas back under Hungarian control. I mean that's absolutely insane. That's like me wearing a UK scarf, having parts of Aquitaine and whatever northern France as part of the UK. It's like, yeah, it's a little bit weird. But so that it fits into this context here. Uh, and his Facebook site showing those borders speak to a hurt and injustice that even I, the child of an immigrant, was taught. We all had a framed picture of the tragedy of Trianon on our walls with the words, "The tragic fate of Hungary" underneath. Of course, I believe that there are gentler and more constructive ways to address problems. Immigrants to Hungary, learning Hungarian language and history could replace a dwindling population. Hungarians could cooperate with Zelensky to protect Hungarian language schools in Ukraine, and the truth could be recognized. Hungarian, I've been told, is a difficult language to learn if you're not a child of Hungary or the diaspora. Still, Hungarians could make the effort to educate those who come across the border on the history and language. Interesting insight there, and this is I love threads that on my videos that have just this mix of different views that allow us to kind of learn from each other. I could go to a Wikipedia page or whatever and give you this information, but it's really nice to be able to get this from the viewers as well. Of course, we have to take everything that people say with a pinch of salt. We don't know who they are necessarily and what agenda they might have. It's not to cast aspersions on what's just been said, of course, at all. So this is Katat saying, "Hi, Jonathan. I'm Hungarian and can tell you that the mainstream media is all controlled by the government. There are only very few independent media outlets, mainly online, in the country. Hungarian people are supporting Ukrainian in this war. There are many humanitarian groups who are doing their best. Unfortunately, the government is a kleptocracy. They are so kleptocracy where there is corruption, they're stealing effectively from the country itself. They are only playing their games and people are paying for it because of the government propaganda. Those who don't have access to the few independent media are identifying themselves with the government's political view because they have only a very narrow and blurred view of what is really going on around them. And this can be said as well for the people in Russia. That's why it's really easy, and I could almost get onto a philosophical discussion about whether libertarian free will exists or not, but I'll park that for now. We won't go there now. But when we look at people inside Russia and blame them, so this is also blameworthiness and praiseworthiness, which is also to do with libertarian free will. Uh, it is, I find it more difficult to blame Russians, like the average Joe on the street, who is parroting the quite horrible, arguably, pro-Kremlin narrative, viewpoints, talking points, and everything. I find it quite hard to be truly blameworthy of them. Like I can say that's not great, that's horrible, but like to personally say, and you are to blame, like you are propping up the Putin regime. It's hard to say that when you understand, if you know, this is where explanation quite often takes away our kind of psychological reactive attitudes to any given situation. Like if I can explain exactly why they've got to that place, then it's difficult for me to say, "You bastard! I can't believe you said that, or you've done that, or your behaviour is just." I mean, it is totally unacceptable when I'm talking about what I would desire to be your behaviour. But if I understand exactly how you got there, and I can map that out, I mean, you can talk the same with criminality, antisocial behaviour, whatever, any behaviour. If I can fully map out why you got to the place where you got to, then actually it's that whole journey that is to blame. It's not you as an individual there. And this is really problematic for many people because it's a case of like, well, we like to blame people. It's much easier. We can say, no, that's all too confusing. I can't blame the universe, right? That doesn't get me anywhere. So it's your fault, and I'm gonna disparage you, and I'm going to discriminate against you, and I'm going to call you a horrible name, and I'm going to say all Russians are bastards or whatever. Whereas the reality is, you're a person who is a victim to, in this case, let's look at the proximal causation to Russia. You are a victim to narratives. You don't have access. You don't have a VPN. You're not technologically minded. You don't know how to get opposing views. You don't want to get opposing views because the way you were brought up, and you were just basically brainwashed into this whole world view. And here you are, like a sponge, soaking up the Russian narrative at no fault of your own. You're not sitting there going, "Oh, I really want to soak this up because X, Y, and Z." It's like you are who you are, and you're in that situation, and you are being manipulated by the state. And in a sense, you are also propping up the state, but it's this like coextensive relationship between you as people and the state pumping out this narrative. You're sucking it up, and you're propping that up, and so on and so forth. How do you break that cycle? It's very easy to blame Russia and say, "Oh, you are X, Y, and Z." It doesn't really help us. Okay, it's not great. I don't like what you're doing, but I understand what you're doing. And that's a really difficult nut to crack. How do we change that going forward? So I'm going really off on one into one of my favorite areas of philosophy. So I should probably draw it back now. So because they only have a very narrow and blurred view of what is really going on around them. So this is back to Hungary, but we can apply this, of course, to much of the population in Russia. This is just in a nutshell. There is so much to add. OV is the Prime Minister of Hungary, but he is not representing the Hungarian people's opinion. And someone else says, "I'm Hungarian. I disagree with Orban and his party about how the Ukrainian situation. I disagree with him over the Ukrainian situation. But Orban made nationalist politics his bed. He now has to sleep in it, and it means distancing from the Ukrainian conflict. Ukrainian ultra-nationalists treated Hungarian minorities badly, so finding support for Ukraine among Hungarian nationalists is hard." And this goes back to what one of the previous commenters was saying. Also, I see Orban wants to balance between the West and the East. That is just how Hungary was for a long time, a gateway between West and East. I think there is freedom of press still, even if the major publications are pro-Orban. It doesn't help that the opposition parties are incompetent. Orban has a narrative, the opposition has theirs, and it's a big divide. Well, the culture war divide. And Hungarians are mostly on the side of conservatism. Very interesting. This is all really useful for being able to get a sense of exactly what is going on and how people feel about Hungary. I'm sure there are some more, but I won't spend too much more time looking for them. If you are Hungarian, you have anything else to add to this, your own personal reflections, please let me know in the comments below. And just something else I wanted to say as well. I work really, quite a lot at this, and time is hard to come by quite often. If any of you know how to get hold of certain people, it's quite difficult. I was hoping to get hold of Operator Starsky, and I shot him a message on Twitter, but like if you're not friends with someone, the algorithm means they don't read, like he's not going to read my message, right? Like a direct message, but he won't read it. He might not even be notified of it. So just being able to get hold of people to say, "Look, do you want to be interviewed?" There are anyone that has any kind of expertise or any insights, I'd love to interview and have a chat with regard to the Ukraine war. So if you have any contacts and you can put them in touch with me, please do so, and we can maybe set up an interview going forward. That'd be fabulous. Right, just going on to other things now. In occupied Donetsk, says Tim White, this is what the Shaktar Stadium looks like these days. Shaktar Donetsk was quite a big Ukrainian football team. This is a former home of Shaktar Donetsk, but after the opening of the Donbass arena, it was used by their reserves and by a smaller team in the city until Russia's invasion. Well, now look at this. Is quite incredible. It's like a rewilding program, and it's amazing how quickly nature can take back what it has been denied. Incredible scenes. So there you go. I it reminds me tangentially. So fish stocks are a problem around the world. We are eating the world out of fish. There are 7 billion humans plus on Earth, and there ain't enough. Uh, there ain't enough. There isn't enough land on Earth to be able to feed human beings the amount of meat, say, that the average American eats or the average European eats or whatever. So there just isn't enough land. So what do we do with that? We need to change. And I don't want to get down that whole route, but with fish stocks, it's the same. Like there's just too many people eating too much fish. So what do we do with that? It was interesting during the Second World War that as certain lanes were unable to be fished, in the Atlantic, we had U-boats, you had all sorts of stuff going on. So there was like 5 years of basically not fishing certain areas, and apparently the fish stocks absolutely rebounded. It was quite incredible. And so you think that nature can rebound if we give it a chance. Uh, with fish stocks, you might say, well, let's take 2 years off here, or fish over there. Have certain areas that you can rotate or whatever. I know I'm going off and talking about something completely different, but this kind of reminds me of that. Anyway, let's get back. Stay on target, Pierce. Stay on target. Star Wars reference there. I'm wearing a Star Wars t-shirt. That sounds sad. I am. Destroying a Ukrainian stronghold. This is Andrew Perpetua talking about uh, a strike here by a first-person view drone where the Russians claimed they destroyed a Ukrainian stronghold. So Andrew Perpetua recently has been really acerbic in his criticism of Russian videos that make claims about stuff. He's got a load of threads saying the Russians have claimed, they put this video out saying how wonderful, they're blowing stuff up or whatever. Here we have a stronghold being destroyed. Actually, it's a first-person drone almost bouncing off the front of a concrete house, and yet that is a stronghold destroyed. So you've got to be careful about these claims, right? Rebar's used to be very big on some of these smaller claims about strongholds being taken here and there. You're like, yeah, don't know what that means, and is that stronghold being destroyed? No, but yeah. So Andrew Perpetua's had threads on certain areas being claimed to be certain events being like a success of the Russians. So they show something blowing up, but actually it signifies them losing ground. He's got one here, but he's got a whole series of these. So Russian proudly published a video depicting themselves losing a significant amount of ground in Pervomaisky. What are you doing showing this? But then, of course, if you're Russian and you're not given the context, so the thing about Andrew Perpetua is he can go and do the geolocations of this stuff, check it with his map, and see that actually the Russians on their Telegram sites or Rebar or Russia Today or whatever are showing this footage, and the assumption is this is the Russians doing an amazing job. Look, we're blowing up Ukrainian stuff. Actually, it signifies them losing ground. So it's just like how, and he then literally geolocates his stuff and says, well, these are the gains that the Ukrainians made in this area south of Vodyany, Pervomaisky. This is Avdiivka area, yeah, as I say, he's got a whole host of these threads that kind of take the mickey out of the Russians for their claims. Right, okay. Going on to Chris Wiki here, who says, Chris O'Wiki, sorry, another open-air dungeon used by the Russian army to imprison its own soldiers has been exposed in the occupied Donetsk region. According to a commander, every unit has one. Although they're illegal, he says nobody gives a hoot. Expletive. Statutes and laws don't apply here. Now, I haven't done all that much on like war crimes and the horrors of war, and goodness me, I could fill up my videos with evidence of these. But we'll delve into this a little bit now. So, I previously uncovered the Russian army's use of Zindans, a medieval form of punishment that has been revived to discipline Russian soldiers serving in Ukraine. See the thread below. The army appears to be using them widely in occupied areas of Ukraine. Astra, which is a Russian independent news outlet, has interviewed a Russian commander who is opposed to the use of Zindans and has apparently filmed one in the village of Olenivka. south of Donetsk city. He says the Zindan is being used to imprison those found guilty of petty offences. Quote, they get a minimum 3 days of imprisonment and a fine, 25 to 30,000 rubles for every day of imprisonment, 293 to 352 rubles. They use it mainly for drunkenness, for leaving their positions and going to the shops, to the countryside, to visit neighbouring positions, or just if the bosses don't have a good look in their eyes. This is the second time I've seen a pit. The first one, as I heard, was closed by the prosecutor's office, but now a new one has been dug in a secret place where no one is allowed. The regiment commander knows about it, and the battalion commander is in charge of it. Soldiers and officers alike are sitting in the pit. They are simply beaten and thrown into it. There's a dirt floor there. You sleep on rags. The prisoners may not be fed or watered. As the commander notes, there are statutory punishments available for such offences, which do not include being thrown into a pit. The fines being levied appear to be simply a means of enriching battalion commanders. This fits in line with both of the threads I discussed yesterday concerning Chris Wiki and corruption. His threads on corruption in the Russian army, going from the very top to the bottom. So the men have electronic payment cards, which they use to access their salaries. According to the commander, the prisoners, quote, make a transfer to a stand-in, and he goes and withdraws the cash, or they give it right away in cash. They always write a receipt saying that they allegedly borrowed the same amount from someone who is always the same fake person until such and such a date. In the end, the money goes into the pocket of the battalion commander. The commander says that the pits are common knowledge, quote, everybody knows about them, everybody shares them with everybody, battalion commanders and their deputies, regimental commanders. I think the higher-ups know too. No one's hiding anything about the pits, as well as the scale of the extortion. If all the regimental commanders were to be investigated up to the deputies of the battalion commander, then these pits would stop. But in the meantime, there is no point in complaining to the higher authority. End quote. Relatives have complained many times about their menfolk being thrown into the Zindans, but this seems to have been largely ignored by the army. The commander is opposed to the use of Zindans and says he won't send any of his men there. Even if they screw up, he says his own men are willing to fight, but are mostly chronically ill, alcoholics, herb smokers. Quote, it's a misconception that the mobilized are charged up Rambos. The average age is around 35. All of them are civilians. The majority are from villages, shift workers mostly, not even a lot of hunters, thanks to Russian gun laws. None of his men have refused to fight, he says, because, quote, you can be shot by your own people. If you do refuse, imprisonment in a pit is divine in comparison. Just another insight into how dysfunctional the Russian army appears to be, right throughout the ranks. Just to finish off today, I have recorded the end of this video, but it's too long to turn into this whole video. It made the whole thing an hour long. It's a Thomas Tyner delve into self-propelled mortars, so I saved that for tomorrow. Really interesting, actually, what he had to say on them. There's a little bit on tractors to come next. I recorded this ages ago, but I had to slice it off for some reason. Anyway, here it is now. That's going to take you to the end of this video. And just final couple of things. So I love this from Defmon. Come on, you didn't even try. Worst barrier ever. I mean, I reckon I could push one of those along the sand there as well. So yeah, that is rubbish. This is awesome. This is another Ukrainian farmer modified a tractor into a remotely controlled demining tool. Now, this tractor is not being driven. First of all, it's got a huge defensive wall on the front as it's shifting stuff in front of it before it plows. The plow is behind it. It's hopefully the intention is it's detonating any mines that might be there. But it's not only that, it is also remotely controlled, which means that if it does hit a mine and the mine is pretty catastrophic to the to the tractor, then no driver, no human is going to die. And that's pretty cool. There's a lot of this kind of innovation going on. farming is obviously massive business and super important to the world, and so this kind of innovation is massively important. Now you can actually do stuff like this. I've sadly enough, I had to do a bit of research on tractors for one of my books. Time to spam my video here. So what happened? I I end up watching loads of YouTube videos on tractors. I've written a couple of books, two in the series so far. Um, Survival of the Fittest Metamorphosis, Survival of the Fittest Adaptation. Please buy these books; that'd be really cool. Some of you have already bought them and given really good reviews. You say please write the third one, which is something I need to do. But anyway, they're there for your delectation. Go and check them out on Amazon, other much better bookshops. Lovely matte covers as well. So yeah, if you buy them in paperback, yeah, nice. Anyway, I watched a load of videos on tractors and was just amazed at the technological advancement of tractors and how you can pretty much program tractors to do your fields in the most efficient way, and you'll get autonomous tractors. Well, they're pretty much there. It'll only be a matter of time before all of this work will be done in a truly mechanized way, and you'll have someone sitting off in a field drinking a cup of tea. I mean, that's my idea of farming, right? Anyway, I just thought I'd share that with you, whilst also going off on one to talk about tractors and books. Because basically there's a big. I wrote the first one before the COVID pandemic. There's a big pandemic. It comes around and destroys the world and whatnot, and you've got people. Obviously, it's zombies, people who are infected or whatever. But for someone who loves their philosophy, that's a really great way to shoehorn in loads of philosophy. Sort of the world getting destroyed and then coming back again, and how moral philosophy and how do people operate and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, these two kids have to the only thing they can find to drive around is a tractor in this farm, and so I had to do my research on how would they drive the tractor and would they be able to do that and blah blah blah, and yeah, that's where research took me. Back to today me. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate all of the wonderful contributors to this channel, all the members and all the people that help me out on Buy Me a Coffee. It's been a long time since I've thanked them by name, so I just want to say a big thank you to David, to Lawrence Heger, to Rand, to another David, to Egon Frederickson, Amanda, Mark M, Andres Erdovics, Glenn Greatorex, Axel Berstrom, Marco Rantanen, Ronan Hartnett, Christoph, someone, David from Scotland, Brian Ivy, Rand again, Brian Hermanson, and Jan David Narkovic. Really appreciate that, Jan. Martin Lee, Rob Sharber, Epic Vlad. Thank you so much for your support. Anyway, take care. Speak soon.